After decades of waiting, America is finally getting some smaller truck options with the new 2022 Santa Cruz and the new 2022 Maverick from Ford. In this video, we're talking about the smallest of the trucks available in America, the all-new Santa Cruz. Now you'll notice I said smaller, not small, because in my opinion, the Santa Cruz and the Maverick are not exactly small trucks. Now for the record, I'm air quoting the small part, not the truck part, because if you want to call the Santa Cruz a truck, that is fine by me. And if you want to call this a mid-sized crossover with a usable functional bed in the back, that is absolutely fine by Hyundai. This might be a weird analogy, so hold on to your hats for a moment, but the same day that the Santa Cruz arrived in my driveway, so did this 14 horsepower gas-powered chipper. Now honestly, this is a really small chipper. It's good for logs about 4 inches or so in diameter. But the reason you might be interested in the Santa Cruz is the same reason that I bought a small chipper. Right tool for the right job. The other ornament in my yard is this chipper here, which I liken to the average half-ton truck. This is quite heavy. It's 6,000 pounds, 10 times heavier than that new lightweight chipper. This can accommodate logs up to about 14 inches in diameter because it's powered by a 3.2-liter Cummins diesel engine. But this is too big and too heavy to get a lot of places out here in the forest, so right tool for the right job. If you need to do half-ton truck things, get a half-ton truck. If, on the other hand, you want a practical and pragmatic alternative to a mid-size crossover in the US with some truck-like qualities, then we have two options, this Santa Cruz and the new Ford Maverick. Up front, this looks an awful lot like the Hyundai Tucson, and that's because the Santa Cruz and the Tucson are very closely related. The front grille is not exactly the same, however. This has LED daytime running lights standard in every model, but they do get a little bit of a tweak in the upper end trims. Full LED headlights below are available. You'll find those in the two top-end trims of Santa Cruz. If you get the two lower-end models, we get halogen headlights. In the center of the lower portion of the bumper, we find a radar adaptive cruise control sensor. This does have all of Hyundai's latest active safety systems on it, but one interesting touch, no fog lights below. So just how small is the smallest truck in America? Well, it's a little bit bigger than some of you might think. Yes, this is definitely small for a 4-door truck with a bed in the back, but as far as vehicles go in North America, this is a bit more mid-sized than anything. It's 195.7 inches long, meaning this is notably longer than something like a 2-row Jeep Grand Cherokee or Hyundai's own Santa Fe. This is almost as long as the 3-row Palisade, but it is an important 4 inches shorter than the Ford Maverick. The Maverick may look like a Bronco Sport, it may be styled like that up front, but it's actually longer on the outside than Ford's own Explorer. Some of you may be cross-shopping this with the Honda Ridgeline. The Ridgeline is an important 15 inches longer. It's also notably wider than the Santa Cruz, so this is going to be easier to park. This is based on a Tucson, but it actually shares incredibly little with the Tucson. It's about 2 inches wider than Hyundai's compact crossover and about 2.5 inches wider than the Maverick. Moving to the back, we have some very distinctive partial LED taillight modules. A bit of a missed opportunity, however, is that this sort of arrow-shaped section right here is not the turn signal. I think that would have been a pretty cool touch. Instead, it's just these two blinking red blocks. As you'd expect in a pickup, we have a tailgate back here. It has an electronic latch, and it can be lowered in 2 stages. You can reposition these little tethers here and either have it go completely flat. Little tethers in this one are a little tight there. You can have it go completely flat like that, or you can have it in a position around here where this is going to be level with the top of the wheel wells, and that's due to the width of the cargo bed. At its widest point, this bed is 53.9 inches wide, but between the wheel wells, it's 42.7. So 4x sheet goods will not fit between the wheel wells, and that's why we have this 2-stage tailgate, very much like we see in the Ford Maverick. The difference between this and the Maverick's bed comes down to a few tenths of an inch. This is 1/10 of an inch wider between the wheels, 3/10 of an inch wider at the widest point, and at the opening right back here by the tailgate. Why then is the Santa Cruz wider than the Maverick? A lot of that just has to do with styling. You'll notice the tail lamps are a little bit wider, the body is a little bit wider in order to give this a different style. And the Maverick is pretty slab-sided. The Santa Cruz that Hyundai sent me has this really cool roller cover on it. Unfortunately, it's in the way of what I want to talk about next, which is the front of the cargo bed. It's not actually vertical, which means that we get a little bit more room at floor level than we find right at the top of the tailgate. It's 52.1 inches long from the tailgate to the very front of the cargo bed at the bottom, but if we step up to here, it's 48.4 inches deep. The reason we don't have a vertical wall at the front of the cargo bed is because the rear seats are not vertical. They are reclined a little bit, and that matches the recline angle of the rear seats. And instead of giving us a little bit of behind the seat storage area like we find in the Ford Maverick, Hyundai decided to put it right back here in the cargo area. This cargo area is a little bit shorter than the one that we find in the Maverick because this vehicle is 4 inches shorter. Like the Ridgeline, but unlike the Maverick, we have a storage area under the cargo bed. This is a polymer cargo bed, which makes it nice and light and easy to open. But this is not as big as the one that we find in the Ridgeline, so you could not put any 24-inch luggage there, but you could keep wetter things there. You can also use this as a cooler. There's a drain plug that you can remove, so you can put ice and sodas in there if you wanted. This roller cargo cover is one of the coolest features on the Santa Cruz. It can support my weight at about 200 pounds. Hyundai does say that you can use it as an extra cargo load floor as well. So if you want to put cargo on top of this and in the bed, you can do both of those simultaneously. This is also watertight, as long as it's not a deluge, but there is just one flaw. It occupies about 12 inches of bed space, even when it's completely retracted. Part of that has to do with this latch mechanism, which occupies about 6 inches. This does centrally lock with the truck, so if the truck is locked, this won't open. And it also has to do with the storage area where that metal cargo cover rolls up into. It's sort of like one of those overhead garage doors in commercial settings. You can see it occupies quite a bit of space inside. If I were buying a Santa Cruz, I have to say I'm pretty torn about this particular accessory. I do like the fact that it is watertight. If we close it here and I grab a hose, then water actually just either sheets off and then down the truck, or it will go through some dedicated drains right along the side of the top. Now, it will also drain right between the top and the tailgate area itself right here. So it does not mean that everything inside will be perfectly dry, but it is going to keep the majority of the rain out. You can just barely see 2 of the drain locations right back there in the rear, and then the rubber drain hose that keeps that coiled up top nice and dry. At the moment, Hyundai gives us 2 engine options, but unfortunately neither one is a hybrid like we do find standard in the Maverick. The base engine in this is a 2.5-liter naturally aspirated engine, basically borrowed out of other Hyundai models. It produces 191 horsepower, 181 pound-feet of torque, and it's mated to an 8-speed traditional automatic transmission. You can get that with front-wheel drive or all-wheel drive. Both versions get you 23 miles per gallon combined. Or you could choose this engine option. It's a 2.5-liter turbocharged engine producing 281 horsepower and a whopping 311 pound-feet of torque. Instead of a traditional 8-speed automatic transmission, on this side of the engine bay, we find an 8-speed wet-clutch dual-clutch transmission. This gives you 22 miles per gallon when you equip it with all-wheel drive. And you're going to want all-wheel drive if you want to tow 5,000 pounds. That's the max tow rating on this vehicle. At the beginning of the year, when Hyundai first launched the Santa Cruz, they stuck their foot in their mouth when they started talking about payload. So let's clear things up. Payload in the Santa Cruz will range from a high of just over 1,900 pounds to a low of 1,411 pounds. And that 1,411 is going to be if you have yours equipped just like I do. Roller shade from the factory, the limited trim, all-wheel drive, 2.5-liter turbocharged engine. Remember that options and trim level will affect your total payload rating. At the launch event, when responding to questions, someone at Hyundai accidentally said that you could only put 660 pounds in the bed. And then Ford picked that up and ran with it for their advertisements on the Maverick, saying, well, hey, you could put all 1,500 pounds in the bed of our Maverick. Let's dissect that a little bit. Max payload rating in the back of this is 1,446 pounds. That's theoretically what the rear axle is rated for. Obviously, in this vehicle, 1,411 pounds is the max payload, and you could put that all in the bed. But very much like the Maverick, if you put 1,500 pounds in the bed of that properly equipped Maverick, it could be as low as 1,200 pounds, depending, again, on the trim level that you get. You wouldn't be able to drive it anywhere, because payload includes the driver, the passenger, all the cargo, and tongue weight for any trailer that you might be towing. Where did the 660 pounds of payload come from? Well, that came from Hyundai's desire to give us a ton of different ways to calculate your payload available in the bed. If you have 5 people on the inside, a driver plus 4 passengers, and you're in the base model, theoretically, you could have 660 pounds left for cargo in the back. Or if you had a driver, a front passenger, a 5,000-pound trailer on the 5,000-pound trailer rated model, you could have 660 pounds of payload left. Or of course, if you were just one 200-pound driver in this model, you could put 1,200 pounds in the back. When properly equipped, the tow rating on the Santa Cruz will be 25% higher than the tow rating that we find on the Ford Maverick. But this particular model does not have the tow hitch on it, so unfortunately, I won't be doing any tow testing in this video. Now, some folks were wondering, why is the fuel economy a little bit lower in this than the 2-liter turbo that we find in the Ford Maverick? First reason is this is a little bit wider, so aerodynamics are a little bit different. We also have wider tires, 245 width tires on this one versus 225s on the last 2-liter turbo model of the Maverick that I drove. And the next reason, of course, is the engine displacement itself. This produces more power, it's a bigger displacement engine, therefore we get a hit of about 3 mpg with this one versus the Maverick with the 2-liter turbo and all-wheel drive. An interesting twist that I did not expect with the Santa Cruz is that all models are going to come standard with a load leveling rear suspension. That's going to maintain the ride height and the distance between the wheel and the top of the wheel well, whether the vehicle has a full load in the back or is completely unladen like it is now. It keeps us from having the raked look that you'll find in some small trucks out there, while also improving handling ability, ride quality, and vehicle safety when you have a full load in the back. This is not an air suspension or an adaptive type of suspension. This is actually a passive load leveling design, very similar to what we see in some of Hyundai's larger crossovers worldwide. It uses a damper with a special valve design, and the motion of the damper actually causes the damper to do the load leveling in the rear. Jumping inside, you'll immediately notice the similarities between this and the Hyundai Tucson on which it's based. The driver and front passenger seats are basically the same design, tweaked just a little bit for the Santa Cruz. We have the same multi-way adjustable function here. Seat bottom cushion does adjust for tilt, which is a nice feature, and a two-way adjustable lumbar support. We have a tilt telescopic steering column with a large range of motion, but the seating position here is certainly more compact crossover, more RAV4, more Tucson, more CR-V, than we find in the average mid-sized truck in America, like a Colorado or a Canyon, or definitely the Toyota Tacoma. The Tacoma actually has kind of an awkward seating position. It's a little bit of an outlier. This is much more comfortable than those seating positions, but also a little bit more reclined. Legroom in the Hyundai Tucson is absolutely class-leading, but in the conversion to a pickup truck, we definitely lose some of the legroom inside. This front seat's adjusted for me at 6 feet tall. You can say I have about 2.5 to 3 inches of legroom left. It could be a bit of a squeeze to put a rear-facing child seat behind a 6-foot-tall driver up front. Now, this other seat is all the way back at its trackside, a 6'5" person in there. It's a bit of a squeeze, but I could get my knees back there, definitely digging into the rear seat back. Headroom is very generous thanks to the boxy profile, even though this model does have the moonroof. In this model, we have rear seat air vents, USB charge-only ports, some storage right there under the rear seats, which pop up, and then the only cup holders you'll find back here are ones in the doors. I definitely think that's a bummer because they could definitely splash around if a drink is in there and you close it. The rear seats don't fold forward like we find in a lot of pickup trucks, so they put the top tether anchors right there under those little doors just behind the rear seats. That may make them a little bit awkward for some child seat designs. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that this is the top end trim, so we have a pretty standard sized moonroof right there over the driver and front passengers' heads. You can see how the roof dips back up right back there to give the rear passengers a bit more headroom. The driver and front passenger have height adjustable shoulder belts and height adjustable headrests. This model has perforated upholstery because the front seats are both heated and ventilated. We have a plastic insert and a shiny imitation metallic insert right there on the back of the front seats. I was a little bit worried that that might feel unusual, but it doesn't actually hit me anywhere weird on the back. Moderate bolstering on the seat back cushions, very little down there on the seat bottom cushion, so larger folks shouldn't have any problems in here. The rest of the interior looks a lot like the interior from the Tucson, but it does not appear that too many parts are directly shared, aside from some of the dashboard components, because this vehicle is just a hair wider than the Tucson. Over on the doors, we have very similar styling to the Tucson with fabric inserts right there, soft touch materials, a few hard plastics. Definitely a more premium interior feel than we find in the Ford Maverick. In the Maverick, even in the very top end trims, all the plastics are very, very hard. That's in order to improve durability and help reduce costs. Now we do find hard plastics here, down there at the bottom of the door, right there around that bottle holder. On the dashboard, there's an interesting accent trim right there on the fabric insert on the dashboard, soft touch materials on the upper section and mid section of the dashboard, hard plastics right here around the glove compartment, which is a large bin style. On the passenger side, we find some tiny holes between the two air vents because this vehicle has one of Hyundai's new diffuse mode settings for the dual zone automatic climate control. If I press this diffuse button right here on the dashboard, it causes air to come out between those two large air vents right there, right out of those perforated sections on the driver and on the passenger side. In the middle of the dashboard, we find one of two different LCD infotainment systems. This is the larger 10.25-inch touchscreen system with touch buttons below. The base model gets a standard 8-inch screen with standard Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. One weird twist is that the larger infotainment system does not support wireless CarPlay, but the smaller system does. We have an engine start-stop button right there, controls for the dual zone automatic climate control, USB input, USB charge-only port. We have a Qi wireless charging mat in some models there, lots of storage going on here. A pretty traditional shifter right here in the middle rather than the Hunt and Peck style shifter that we find in other Hyundai vehicles. Behind the shifter we find a drive mode toggle, a button to command more power to the rear axle, auto brake hold, 360-degree camera option, hill descent control, electric parking brake, two very large cup holders right there between the front seats, and then a button bank behind all that where we find the controls of the heated ventilated seats and the heated steering wheel. There's a large padded center armrest, and that opens to reveal a moderately sized storage compartment. It's obvious that Hyundai wanted this dashboard to look very symmetrical, so over on the driver's side we don't find a hood or a binnacle for the instrument cluster. Instead we just find an LCD that's the same size as the infotainment system in this particular model. Now the full LCD instrument cluster is not of course standard, but you'll find it on the upper end trims. There are 4 different themes for this instrument cluster. 3 of them have dials, and then one is this very unusual cube look, which is definitely not my preference. Let me know what you think about that look down there in the comment section. The steering wheel looks very similar to the one that we find in the Tucson. Sport grips up top, leather wrapped in this trim. The grips on either side feature a metallicized plastic strip, hard plastics on the inside in a different texture than the ones that we find elsewhere on the steering wheel. You'll find the controls for the infotainment system over here on the left. Phone button, volume up, track forward, backward, paddles on the back of the steering wheel, and then the controls for the adaptive cruise control system and lane keeping assistance on the right. Thanks to the 2.5-liter turbo and all-wheel drive, this model is going to be the fastest one 0 to 60. This one did it in 5.8 seconds. Now, if you get the base engine, it's going to be closer to 8.5 seconds, so very similar to the average base compact crossover in the US. Curb weight of this is over 4,000 pounds when equipped with the 2.5-liter turbo and the all-wheel drive system. So curb weight on this is actually a little bit higher than something like the Hyundai Santa Fe. That makes sense because this is bigger. Again, this is about the same size as a Hyundai Palisade, and that's one of the reasons they put the more powerful engine in this rather than simply sticking with, say, the 1.6-liter turbo. In my braking test, it took about the same distance for this to stop from 60 miles an hour to 0 as the Hyundai Tucson. Keep in mind this has 245 with tires on it, so I expect this to stop shorter than the Ford Maverick. The Maverick is a little bit lighter, but the tires in most versions are definitely narrower than the ones that we find on the Santa Cruz. The wider tires also help the Santa Cruz feel more confident out on the road. As far as handling goes, I'm going to give this an A, but an A with a question mark because we're talking about a segment of 2 vehicles, this and the Ford Maverick. You have nothing else really to compare this to other than the average compact crossover. And this does feel a lot like the Hyundai Tucson, admittedly a bigger, slightly longer, slightly heavier Tucson out on the road. This feels a little bit more car-like in its driving nature than the Ford Maverick. Part of that is the tire choice on the Santa Cruz, but the rest of it is the suspension design. If you get the front-wheel drive Santa Cruz, you still get a multi-link independent rear suspension. And in the Ford Maverick, you only get that kind of rear suspension if you choose all-wheel drive. If you choose front-wheel drive, then you get a non-independent torsion beam rear suspension. You'll certainly notice the difference if you start pushing both vehicles harder out on a less than perfect road surface, or even the average road surface like the one that I'm on here. The rear end of the Maverick will definitely chatter across the pavement more than the Santa Cruz. This definitely can handle those off-camber situations, rough road situations more elegantly than the Maverick. Out on a rougher road, like the gravel road that I'm on here, ride quality in the Santa Cruz is pretty decent for a pickup truck, and I think a lot of that has to do with the load leveling suspension in the rear. Because of the load leveling nature of the dampers, the springs don't have to be quite as firm as they would otherwise need to be in order to support the kind of payload that this vehicle is capable of. So in terms of ride quality, I did notice that this feels a little bit more crossover-like and perhaps a little bit less truck-like than the Ford Maverick. Keep in mind the Maverick is less expensive, and that's part of why we find some of the features in this vehicle like the load leveling suspension, standard wireless CarPlay, etc. in the base model of this, and we don't see those features available in the Maverick. It's all very price-driven. Of course, if ride quality is a prime concern for you, then you're probably going to want to take a look at something like the Hyundai Santa Fe. It definitely will have a softer, more compliant ride than the Santa Cruz. Cabin noise is pretty comparable to the Tucson, as you'd logically expect. The cab here is actually a little bit smaller than the average compact crossover since there's no cargo area behind the rear seats. So I recorded 71.5 decibels in here, making this among the quietest if you want to compare this to a small crossover. We see a very similar cabin noise score in the upper end versions of the Ford. Now when it comes to fuel economy, I've been averaging above the EPA estimates. I've been averaging 24 mpg in this vehicle over a week of mixed driving, but you'll notice that that is still below where we see the 2-liter turbo in the Ford, and definitely below the standard hybrid system. I think pretty much everybody was expecting that hybrid system in the Maverick to be optional rather than standard, and to be perfectly honest, that is an incredibly fuel-efficient hybrid system. I really hope that Hyundai puts their 1.6-liter turbo hybrid into the Santa Cruz at some point in time. Obviously it fits in the Santa Fe and it fits in the Tucson, so it should fit under the hood of this vehicle. There's also a plug-in hybrid in Hyundai's portfolio that could probably be grafted into the Santa Cruz. That would also be really cool to see, but at this point in time, Hyundai has not said anything about a hybrid or plug-in hybrid model just yet. So as far as fuel economy goes, I'm going to have to give this a C because you will get better fuel economy in the average compact crossover out there, and you'll get better fuel economy in the only competitor to the Santa Cruz that exists at the moment. Before we move on to pricing, I need to talk about the transmission in the 2.5-liter turbo model. This is an 8-speed wet clutch dual clutch system, so the clutch unit is swimming in a fluid bath. This is a dual clutch design, so it's a robotically shifted manual, and it feels very much like Volkswagen and Audi's latest DCTs. It's important to remember that this transmission is at its heart a manual transmission, and when we're on a hill like I'm on right now and I take my foot off of the brake pedal, It's slipping the clutch inside that fluid bath in order to keep this vehicle planted and make it feel more like a car with an automatic transmission. You will definitely notice that the gear shifts feel very quick and very crisp, just as you'd expect out of a dual clutch transmission, but some feelings may also be a little bit unusual. Slower starts and slower stops are smoother than with a dry clutch transmission, like Hyundai's older 7-speed DCT design, but first gear is also pretty low, so it has a very direct engagement feel. It's not going to be quite as smooth when starting off from a stop or in slow and go and stop and go traffic as a traditional 8-speed automatic transmission, but this version is pretty close. Now, if you're towing a trailer or if you're doing mild off-roading with your Santa Cruz, keep in mind that transmissions like this will likely heat up faster than a traditional automatic transmission with a torque converter. And that's part of the reason that first gear is so low. It's trying to engage that gear as quickly as possible, and it's completely engaged going maybe about 4 or 5 miles an hour. But if you're on a trail trying to go half a mile an hour, it can feel a little bit unusual. And if you're trying to start with a trailer on a really steep slope, the feeling will also likewise be a little bit unusual. Now again, unfortunately, this particular truck does not have the hitch, so I was not able to do any towing. Now let's take a deep dive into Santa Cruz pricing. It's going to start at $23,990. That gets you the base 2.5-liter 4-cylinder engine, the 8-speed automatic transmission, and if you want all-wheel drive, it's $1,500 extra. There are 4 different trim levels. Most folks will probably be buying the SEL trim at $27,190. That buys you the power seat, heated seats, up front, XM radio, and push-button start. If you want the 2.5-liter turbocharged engine, you're going to need the SEL premium trim, and that's going to start at $35,680. The limited trim is the most expensive trim, and that starts at $39,720. These prices are all before the destination charge. Now, depending on how you want to look at it, the Santa Cruz is either a good value or it's a little on the pricey side. When we look at our first competitor, the Ford Maverick, you can see why you might think that the Santa Cruz is expensive, because it starts at $19,995. Ford was so aggressive with the pricing on the Maverick, I think pretty much everybody in the industry was shocked. More shocking, the hybrid system is standard in the Maverick, and that will get you about 40 mpg as long as you drive it gently. If you want the 2-liter turbo, that's going to be an extra $1,085, so if you simply want a small truck and turbocharged power, it's going to be a lot less expensive in the Ford. If you want to add all-wheel drive to your 2-liter turbo, that's going to be a pretty pricey upgrade, adding $3,305 because of some of the additional changes that brings with it. The Maverick also tops out less expensive than the Santa Cruz at $34,865. Pretty much any way you slice it, the Maverick is going to be less expensive than the Santa Cruz and generally speaking more fuel efficient as well. But they're not exactly the same kind of vehicle. The Maverick is a little bit smaller on the inside and it's a little bit longer, interestingly enough. The Santa Cruz is actually the slightly shorter vehicle. But the big thing that separates these two vehicles from one another is their mission. The Maverick really appears to be a miniaturized truck for classic Ford truck shoppers. Its interior is definitely less premium than the Santa Cruz. It's a little bit more rough and ready, a little bit more rugged. It has a little bit more of a focus on cargo practicality in the bed, and I really love the fact that it comes with the standard trailer brake controller if you get the tow package option. Any way you slice it, you're going to be able to haul more or tow more in the Santa Cruz than in the Maverick, but it doesn't have an integrated trailer brake controller, which I do think is an interesting omission. According to Hyundai's research, the most direct competitor to the Santa Cruz might not be the Maverick, it might actually be their very own Hyundai Tucson or some other compact crossover on sale in the US, be it a RAV4, a CR-V, or perhaps a Volkswagen Tiguan. And that makes a lot of sense because the Santa Cruz is definitely styled like a Tucson. It shares a lot of components with the Tucson, including portions of the drivetrain, interior, and exterior styling. On the outside, the Santa Cruz is definitely bigger than the Tucson. That's the important thing to keep in mind. In order to give you compact crossover-like room on the inside and a usable truck bed in the back, it has to be about the same size as a 3-row crossover. So if you're in an urban area, theoretically the target for a Maverick or a Santa Cruz, you might actually find the crossover easier to park because it's going to be shorter. Parallel parking is going to be easier. Now, obviously, parallel parking a Santa Cruz or a Maverick is going to be an awful lot easier than parallel parking a 4-door F-150, but we're talking about shades here. Obviously, the Maverick and the Santa Cruz are smaller than the average half-ton truck, but they may not be quite as small as you're thinking. I would encourage you to actually see them in person if that's something of concern. Now, if you want more power, you want the Santa Cruz, because the Tucson does not get the 2.5-liter turbo, interestingly enough. If you want a more powerful Tucson, you're going to need to get the plug-in hybrid version that is 261 horsepower. The hybrid version is a little bit less than that, and then we have the base engine in that model. But any way you slice it, the Santa Cruz is going to be less expensive than the other Hyundai crossovers, and that really is the interesting and unexpected twist here. You might be looking at the price tag of the Santa Cruz thinking to yourself, that's more expensive than the Maverick. But then if you're actually shopping in the target market for the Santa Cruz, which would be the Hyundai Tucson shopper, the Santa Cruz is less expensive. The Tucson starts at $25,350 for the SE trim. The Santa Cruz is $23,990. And right on up the options list, the Santa Cruz is generally speaking going to be less expensive. So for the customer that's hanging out on the Hyundai lot debating about Tucson versus Santa Cruz, I think it's really just going to come down to where do you want to put your cargo? Are you willing to give up a little bit of rear seat room? Remember that the Santa Cruz doesn't have quite as large of a rear seat as we find in the Tucson in order to get a approximately 4.5-foot bed in the rear. Or would you rather have your cargo on the inside where it's going to be a little bit more protected than it would be in the bed of a pickup truck, but it's also going to be a little bit more limited because if you wanted to get a plant from Home Depot and it sticks out the top, or you wanted to load up a barbecue or some other big item in the back, you could obviously strap that into the rear of the Santa Cruz. It could hang out the tailgate, just like cargo tends to do in pickup trucks, and it's an awful lot easier than having cargo hanging out a hatchback in an SUV. If I were shopping for a compact crossover like a RAV4 or a CR-V or a Tucson or a Ford Escape, I would definitely put the Santa Cruz and the Ford Maverick on your shopping list because it offers a lot of the creature comforts and interior space that you'd find in that average compact crossover with arguably a more practical cargo area in the rear. But again, a cargo area with a little bit of a twist. For some folks, it may not be more practical, but I suspect for a lot of folks, it really will be, especially if you live in the average suburban or urban environment where you might want to be able to carry something larger in the back than your compact crossover can accommodate. There are obviously going to be a few practical things that you're going to have to give up. Putting child seats in the back is going to be a little bit trickier. Rear seat legroom is a little bit more limited, but aside from that, these are two absolutely excellent options. When it comes to being a truck, I think the Santa Cruz actually does a little bit better of a job than the Ford Maverick. Payload and tow ratings are a little bit higher. I like the format of the vehicle just a little bit better. But the Maverick is absolutely adorable, and it's incredibly fuel efficient. That is one area where Hyundai has really dropped the ball, I think, in the Santa Cruz. I really wish that they had brought this to market with the 1.6-liter turbocharged hybrid system that we do find currently in the Tucson. Now, the rumor mill says that we might find that at some point later in the Santa Cruz, but really at the moment, I think that's the only big omission. Because for a lot of folks out there that are in the market that I've just described, that person that's looking for a compact crossover, you could get a Ford Maverick with 40 mpg as long as you're willing to give up all-wheel drive, and it's not going to be terribly expensive. If you can get your hands on one, of course, because the Ford Maverick appears to be absolutely nowhere on dealer lots. They're completely sold out for 2022. Definitely keep that part in mind, and it appears that you will likely be able to get your hands on the Santa Cruz on dealer lots if you're looking for one now. Maverick, again, not quite so much. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below, and what would you pick if you were shopping for something in this segment between a Tucson, a Santa Cruz, or a Ford Maverick? Let me know your thoughts down there. Find me over at facebook.com/AlexNautos, Instagram, all those other social places, and of course, check out the merch store at awaymerch.com. I'll see all of you later.